We celebrate today the feast of the conversion of Saint Paul. Most of us are possibly aware that Paul was not Paul before his conversion. He was named Saul. And Saul was a righteous Jew. Saul was a man who followed the law. Saul was a man who kept the commandments. Saul was a man who could not be faulted, a man who lived exactly not only by the law, but by the letter of the law. And because he noticed a group called people of the way, he noticed a group called followers of Christ, that Saul decided that that was not the way. It could not be the way, because in that way, love took precedence over law. In that way, people were allowed freedom that he had never experienced. And so Saul began to look at that way as a challenge. Saul began to look at that way as in a contrast with his, and so began persecuting the followers of the way. In two accounts in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9 and chapter 22, we are given an experience of the conversion of Paul. Paul was on his way to Damascus. He was on his horse. And the reason why he was going to Damascus was because he had letters in order to persecute Christians. He had the backing of the authorities of religion. And so he was very clear that it was one mission that he was called to, and that mission was to persecute the followers of the way, to persecute the disciples of Jesus. Even as he rode with this one-pointed agenda, he saw and was blinded by a light and was thrown down from his horse. He wondered what this phenomenon could be, and he began to ask questions, and in his questions he received the answer that he was to become now a new person. And because this new person could not be named Saul, he was to be named Paul. Today, along with Peter, Paul is considered the architect of Christianity. Jesus is the builder. Jesus laid the foundation, but Paul and Peter both continued in their own inimitable way this work which Jesus inaugurated. And so the Saul who became Paul became a transformed human being. And there are three aspects of Paul that we can take for our reflection today, which show his transformation. The first is, Paul was converted from law to love. A man who was really keeping the letter of the law. A man who was faithful to every single commandment. A man who never disobeyed any of the commandments now became a man for whom love was above the law, love was above the commandments, and like Jesus before him was able to summarize the commandments of the 10 into one, which is loving God by loving neighbor. In all of his letters, Paul speaks of this love of God which he experienced. In Romans chapter 8, verses 31 to 37, he extols a God whose love knows no bounds. He extols a God who is unconditionally and magnanimously loving. He extols a God who keeps no record of wrongs. In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verses 4 to 8, Paul gives a very beautiful treatise on love when he says that love is patient, love is kind, love keeps no record of wrongs, love is not irritable, love is not boastful, and in a sense, you might say, he was describing himself after his conversion. And so, the first aspect that each one of us can reflect on about this transformation of Paul is from Saul to Paul and from law to love. The second aspect is what we call inclusivity as exposed to exclusivity. Paul regarded himself as a Pharisee, and the meaning of the word Pharisee is separated one. So Paul saw himself as a separated one who was separate from all others whom he would consider sinners. A man who was righteous, a man who lived according to the traditions, a man who never disobeyed a single commandment, and so therefore considered himself as apart from everybody else, as superior to everybody else, as the boss of everyone else. And yet, the moment he was touched by the Lord, he remembered who the Lord was. The Lord never considered himself as superior. The Lord considered himself as servant and slave of all. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus summarizes his mission in these words when he says, "The Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve." And Paul took this phrase of Jesus seriously, took this exhortation of Jesus seriously, and became a man who included now others, who was not exclusive, and therefore in many letters his introduction begins with these words from Paul, a servant and an apostle. Paul was both apostle, one who was sent out by the Lord to proclaim his message of love, but Paul was also servant who lived out that message. And even though Paul wrote a number of letters to a variety of communities, what is more important is that Paul lived out what he wrote. Paul could be so bold as to speak of his gospel because he knew that the gospel that he proclaimed was a gospel received from the Lord himself, and that gospel had only one point which Paul took on himself, the summarizing of the 10 commandments into one, of treating everyone as a brother or a sister. And that is why he can say, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no male or female, but all of us are one because we are one in the Lord. In his first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 12, verses 12 to 31, Paul gives an analogy of the church, gives an analogy of this institution of the Lord when he tells us that the Lord and his institution might be compared to a human person. And the Lord is the head. And every one of us is a part of the body. There is no exclusivism. We are one composite whole. The whole of humanity, no matter of what caste, no matter of what creed, no matter of what religion, is moving towards this inclusivity, is moving towards this goal for which God destined us. Because God was in Jesus reconciling the world to himself. And the third aspect that we can take for our reflection today, which is also very relevant in our times, is that Paul became, you might say, an ecologist. A number of his metaphors are metaphors from nature. When he speaks about seeds, when he speaks about trees, when he compares the seed and the tree to the human person, Paul is asking us to be aware of the situation in our world at this time. Every one of us knows that we are living in a world which is slowly being destroyed. Natural resources which the Lord has given us in such abundance like water are being indiscriminately wasted, so much so that we do not know what the future is going to be, that we do not know how we are going to leave this world for the future generations. And Paul says in Corinthians that the Lord was reconciling the world, not only human beings, but the Lord was reconciling nature as well. And so therefore, in celebration of the feast of the conversion of Paul, let us remember these 3 points which we take for our own reflection. And the first is that love always supersedes the law. When in doubt, do the most loving thing. There is no exclusivity. There is no us and them. There is no they and I. There is only inclusivity. There is only inclusiveness. There is only moving together in harmony toward that beautiful destination which we call heaven, which we call the kingdom of God. And finally, let us be concerned about nature. Let us reduce the use of things so that we might leave this world a better place for future generations. Let the conversion of Paul be our own conversion from wasters to users, and not indiscriminate waste, but thinking before we can use. A happy feast of the conversion of St. Paul to everyone.